As the final tale fades into the darkness, you can't help but wonder, what's lurking out there in the deepest corners of the internet? These stories may have left you with a chill running down your spine. But are they truly over, or just the beginning? The web is full of whispers hidden in the shadows, waiting to pull you deeper into the unknown. So remember, the next time you click, you might just stumble upon a tale darker than the ones you've heard tonight. Stay cautious, stay curious, but above all, stay safe. Because once you venture too far, there's no turning back. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more terrifying stories from the web's darkest corners. Until next time, don't let the darkness follow you home. 1. The Man in the Vents. Sarah had just moved into her first apartment, a cozy one-bedroom unit on the top floor of an old building in Chicago. The rent was cheap and the landlord seemed friendly enough. It was perfect, or so she thought. On the second night, she started hearing faint rustling sounds coming from the air vents. At first, she dismissed it as mice or maybe the wind, but the noises grew louder, scraping, tapping, almost like breathing. She mentioned it to her landlord, who brushed it off with a dismissive wave, claiming the building was old and the noises were probably just the pipes settling. But Sarah couldn't shake the gnawing unease that crept over her each night. The way the air seemed to grow heavier and the shadows deeper as soon as the sun went down. One evening, as she tried to relax on the couch, binge-watching her favorite show to distract herself, her eyes wandered to the vent in the corner. It was almost an accident, a casual glance, but what she saw turned her blood to ice. Two faint, bloodshot eyes stared back at her, unblinking, as if they'd been watching her for a long, long time. The edges of the vent seemed to pulse, and she thought, just for a moment, she heard the faintest intake of breath. Terrified, she bolted to her neighbor's apartment and called the police. When they arrived and pried open the vent, they found a man wedged inside, clutching a knife. He'd been living in the air ducts for weeks, sneaking into Sarah's apartment when she was out. The landlord admitted he'd been ignoring complaints about strange noises from previous tenants. Sarah never went back to that apartment. Part 2. The Forgotten Phone Call. 3 years ago, Mark lost his mother to a sudden illness. She'd always been his rock, and her death left a void he couldn't fill. One night, while scrolling aimlessly through his phone, he found her old number still saved. On a whim, he dialed it, knowing full well the line was disconnected. To his shock, the call went through. Static crackled, and then, "Mark?" It was her voice. "Why did you call me?" His heart raced. "Mom? Is this some kind of joke?" "Mark, listen to me." Her voice was urgent, trembling. "You need to check the basement, now." The call abruptly ended, leaving Mark sitting in stunned silence. His hands trembled as he grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made his way to the basement. The air down there was stale and heavy, carrying a faint chemical odor he hadn't noticed before. Tucked behind a stack of forgotten boxes, he discovered the source, a gas leak hissing softly from a corroded pipe. The leak was severe enough that, if left unchecked, it could have killed him in his sleep. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. That call had saved his life. But how? The next day, he contacted the phone company to report the strange incident. Their response chilled him further. The number was indeed disconnected, and there was no record of any outgoing or incoming calls at that time. They had no explanation for how the line could have been active. Mark now keeps his mother's number saved in his phone. Sometimes, late at night when the house is too quiet, he stares at it, his finger hovering over the call button. He hasn't dialed it again, but he knows that if he ever hears her voice once more, it won't be by accident. Part 3. The roommate's secret Jen had been sharing an apartment with Claire for 6 months. They weren't best friends, but they got along well enough to coexist without much conflict. Claire worked late shifts at the hospital, often returning in the early hours of the morning, so Jen usually had the place to herself at night. At first, she enjoyed the solitude, a chance to watch her favorite shows, read in peace, or even dance around the living room without judgment. But over time, the quiet began to feel oppressive, as if the apartment itself had grown aware of her aloneness. Shadows seemed to stretch further across the walls, and creaks in the floor became too frequent to ignore. Still, she convinced herself it was just an overactive imagination, bolstered by too many late-night horror movies. One evening, Jen was cleaning Claire's side of the living room when she accidentally knocked over a stack of papers. Among them was a black and white photograph of Claire standing in a field. Behind her was a dark figure, blurred but unmistakably human. When Claire came home, Jen asked about the photo. Claire's face turned pale. "Where did you find this?" she whispered. "It was in your papers. Who's the guy in the background?" Claire's voice cracked. "That's my ex. But he's dead." Over the next few weeks, Jen started hearing footsteps in the apartment when she was alone. Objects would move, doors would slam. One night, she woke up to find Claire standing at the foot of her bed, staring at her with blank, tear-filled eyes. "He's here," Claire said. "He's angry." Jen moved out the next day. She still doesn't know what became of Claire. Part 4. The Shadow on the Stairs. Late one night, a Reddit user shared a chilling story about growing up in a 19th century farmhouse, a place steeped in history and silence. The house had a narrow, creaky staircase leading to the attic, and every step on it seemed to echo with a hollow, unsettling sound. From the moment she was old enough to notice, the attic had given her an uneasy feeling, a sense that something watched from the darkness just beyond the door. Her parents brushed it off, insisting it was just her imagination, blaming her fear on ghost stories or the way the wind howled through the old house on stormy nights. But she couldn't ignore the way the staircase seemed colder than the rest of the house, or how the shadows near it always felt darker, heavier, as though they carried a secret. One night, she woke up to the sound of heavy footsteps climbing the stairs, slow and deliberate, as if whoever it was wanted to be heard. Her heart raced as she assumed it was her dad checking the attic, but something about the rhythm of the steps felt wrong. When she peered out of her bedroom door, her blood ran cold. A dark shadow, tall, with elongated limbs and a hunched posture, was creeping up the steps. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as though it was struggling to control its own body. She stifled a scream, clamping her hand over her mouth, and ducked back into her room, trembling. For what felt like an eternity, she sat frozen, the muffled sound of the steps growing fainter until they disappeared altogether. But even then, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, waiting just out of sight. Frozen in terror, she ducked back into her room and hid under the covers, her heart hammering so loudly she feared it might give her away. She stayed like that for hours, unable to sleep, every creak of the house sending fresh waves of fear through her. At dawn, she cautiously peeked out and found her dad already awake, inspecting the attic. He had found the attic door wide open, though it had been locked the night before. Nothing appeared to be missing, but the old rocking chair in the corner was moving, creaking rhythmically, as though someone had just stood up from it. The dust on the floor, undisturbed for years, now had streaks, as if dragged by unseen hands. Her parents dismissed it as an animal, maybe the wind, but she knew better. The atmosphere in the house grew heavier after that night, filled with inexplicable noises and shadows that darted just out of view. They moved out shortly after, but even years later, she'd wake in the middle of the night, half expecting to hear those footsteps again. Subscribe for more daily updates about Horror Story Part 5. The Voice in the Baby Monitor. Lila and Tom were first-time parents, overjoyed but exhausted. One night, while their newborn slept, they relaxed in the living room with the baby monitor by their side. The soft static lulled them until a voice cut through. "He's such a sweet boy," the voice whispered. Tom jumped up, grabbing the monitor. "Who's there?" he shouted. The voice laughed softly. "Don't worry, I'm just watching." Tom sprinted to the nursery, his heart pounding in his chest. But the baby was sleeping peacefully, alone in his crib. The room was silent, save for the soft whirring of the ceiling fan. They checked every corner of the house, opening closets, peering under beds, and even stepping out into the yard to make sure no one was there. Nothing. Yet the chill in the air lingered, and the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave them. After that night, the baby monitor stayed off, gathering dust on the shelf. Leela refused to stay home alone, jumping at the slightest noise, always convinced there was something or someone lurking just out of sight. Part 6. The Craigslist. Haunting, Kevin was in college when he found a steal of a deal on Craigslist. A desk for $20, barely used. He picked it up from an elderly man who seemed eager to get rid of it. "You'll take good care of it, right?" the man asked nervously. Kevin assured him he would. That night, Kevin was burning the midnight oil, bent over his books, when he heard a faint tapping sound. At first, he ignored it, chalking it up to the usual creaks and groans of his old apartment. But the sound persisted, irregular yet deliberate, like someone or something trying to get his attention. He glanced around the room, his eyes sweeping over the shadows pooling in the corners. But there was nothing out of place. The tapping continued, a soft yet maddening rhythm that seemed to grow louder with each passing minute. Frustrated and unable to concentrate, Kevin slammed his book shut, the sharp sound echoing in the silent room. And then abruptly the tapping stopped. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. As his gaze fell back to the desk, his breath caught in his throat. Subscribe, there carved into the surface of the wood as if by an unseen hand, were the words, "Help me." The letters were jagged and uneven, as though scratched in haste, and they gleamed faintly in the dim light of his desk lamp, as though freshly etched. A chill ran down his spine, and he recoiled from the desk, his chair screeching against the floor. He stared at the words, half expecting them to vanish, but they remained, stark and undeniable. He couldn't explain it, didn't want to, but he felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as though the plea wasn't just a message but a warning. The next morning, he packed up the desk and sold it online, desperate to be rid of it. But the unease lingered. Weeks later, as he scrolled through Craigslist out of morbid curiosity, his heart sank. There it was, the same desk, now listed for free. The description read, "Take it, please." Kevin sold the desk the next day. Weeks later, he saw another Craigslist ad for the same desk, listed for free. The description read, "Take it, please." These stories remind us that the world is full of unexplained horrors lurking just beyond the edge of reason, a realm where shadows stretch too long, where whispers come from empty rooms, and where reality itself can twist in ways we'd rather not understand. Maybe tonight, as you close your eyes and listen to the silence, you'll wonder, what's watching you? And perhaps if you're very still, you might hear it breathe.